When Tetsuya Takahashi was working on his first project as a fresh employee at Square, which happened to be a simple wall in Final Fantasy IV, I'd assume he might have had a hard time believing that he'd develop into the polarizing visionary responsible for one of the most challenging, ambitious, and beautiful yet tragically flawed series in all of video gaming history, the Xeno series. He, along with the prodigiously talented Kaoru Tanaka, known by her pen name Xenosaga, who herself got her footing in the industry by working on Final Fantasy titles as well, infused heady philosophical allusions and religious symbolism into their work, and both kept these admittedly recondite cornerstones from overwhelming the narrative. Xenogears was a tale inspired by classic sci-fi literature and films, and that inspiration would continue on to Xenosaga in both subtle and overt ways. Though Takahashi might not have immediately realized the deep love and infatuation that developed with many of the fans after experiencing Xenogears, and was undoubtedly a little bit embarrassed by several of the game's weaker aspects, he found the letters and praise from passionate fans to be massively uplifting and motivational. He stated, "When the reactions from the fans started coming in and we kept climbing on the user rankings in the game magazines, that became a big inspiration to me." Takahashi knew that he wanted this project to continue, a project that according to he and Tanaka expanded robustly even while working on Xenogears, and though it would be almost completely reimagined by the time Der Wille zur Macht came out, with obvious similar thematic, structural, and philosophical underpinnings of course, both knew early on that this expansive and deeply complex project had many layers and episodes left to explore. But he also knew that Square intended to place major resources and focus on Final Fantasy, something he was not interested in and even critical of in the moment. There was also the problem that his games didn't really fit into Square's template. Takahashi and Tanaka wanted players to question themselves and ponder weightier concepts rather than to singularly pursue a major and overbearing central villain, though there were certainly major villains to be toppled in their creations. And I'd also argue that Final Fantasy introduces some hefty conundrums for the player to grapple with as well. They just don't fold as many esoteric frameworks into them as the Xeno series does. He inevitably elected to leave Square along with 50 other employees on October 1st, 1999, and formed Monolith Soft under the parent company Namco. Without Namco, given how expensive RPGs were to produce, Monolith Soft, let alone the Xeno project, simply wouldn't have been possible. The Xenosaga project was eventually revealed, after much hinting, and the first trailer came in the spring of 2001. Originally, 6 installments were planned, and there were many aspects of the new series that mirrored the original idea Takahashi and Tanaka had for Xenogears, both conceptually and thematically, but outside of that, it was a completely different story. Xenosaga Episode 1 would be released in Japan in February 2002, and in the States in February of 2003. Though it was quite successful in the West, selling over 500,000 copies in the United States, it only sold half the number of what Xenogears did in Japan. And because of this, it was hard to justify the scope and scale of Takahashi's vision, and his project would be significantly scaled back, most notably from 6 episodes to 3, which obviously sheared some of the planned story and important developments. There are a lot of potential reasons for this. I view it as a confluence of overambitious goals. While the story was no doubt more focused, it wasn't self-contained and revealed little while teasing at entirely unexplained events, organizations, and characters. Though this was, to an extent, to be expected from the opening title in a series, it was so sparse with its revelations that many derisively labeled it a flimsy prologue, that it hardly classified as a bona fide, substantive entry that was expected to establish the foundation of one of the more grand epics, potentially, in video gaming history. Still others complained about the incessant onslaught of long and verbose cutscenes that were occasionally interrupted by requests that the player save, only to initiate another 10-minute cutscene. Takahashi's love for film was most evident in his enthusiasm when directing them, almost 8 hours worth of cutscenes. Tanaka even mentioned that the programmers jokingly called him Akuma, and because of his perfectionism and obsession with details. Takahashi's desire was for Xenosaga's content to be associated not with Japanese animation but with cinema. In a statement to Superplay magazine, Takahashi stated, "It might look like anime, but if you look at the scenario, camera work, and the clips, you'll clearly notice that inspiration is borrowed from various existing movies." There are obvious connections to Tarkovsky's Solaris and Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, considering the deliberate inclusion of stretches of silence to highlight the vast nothingness of space. There are other references to RoboCop, Blade Runner, and even Return of the Jedi. I will say that often these cutscenes added some cool and engaging action-packed moments and helped bring the player up to speed, since some of the early developments needed more elaboration. As I mentioned, the game introduces a lot of organizations, political alignments, and in-universe terminology and jargon. However, the length and frequency did cause burnout. The beginning of any game is crucial, and instead of the player being dropped into a complex world and allowed to fill it out with the occasional reorientation, Episode 1 elected to severely limit the filling out process in the early game, and though I'm not personally wholesale against this method as it can deliver a more focused and precise story if done right, I can see how it almost instantly severed a chunk of fans from its base. On top of that, while Takahashi did present more cinematic cutscenes and the careful way that he constructed each scene was noticeable, I'm not sure how collectively immersive they were, given the sheer number of them. Like in many other areas, Takahashi went all out. In this instance, a little restraint while wrapping up some loose ends and smaller expository dumps might have held more players' attention for longer. The game starts with Shion, a human scientist employed by Vector Industries, performing some final test on Cosmos, a prototype anti-Gnosis battle android, on board the Woglinde when the crew retrieves a Zohar emulator, one of 13 replicas of the Zohar, which is a source of immense power and serves as a connection between the upper domain of God and the lower domain of human collective consciousness, and thus can be viewed as a channel to contact God through. If that doesn't further drill home the immediate depth and, at times, unfortunately, bloatedness of this story and lore, then consider that this is the extreme tip of the iceberg. I've already stated twice, the lamentable presence of technobabble and references to ill-explained background characters and artifacts only further pollute this story if, and this is admittedly a big if, you're not already attracted to tales that allude to a world's layers and make you wait patiently for hours, and sometime entire games, before letting you peel them back. I do enjoy this, quite a bit actually, but I must mention how tedious it might be to some. Where Episode 1 truly shines is its characters. Each character has a distinct background and deep emotional baggage, with problems that saturate the story with philosophical conundrums and thoughtful, but in-character exchanges. I find that many stories striving to hit the player with a number of complex problems, such as determinism and free will, transhumanism, personal agency, Nietzschean philosophy, I often find it necessary to turn one or two characters into philosophy dumps, or worse yet, use characters to explain tougher concepts while shredding all previous characterization, which often might enhance a game's thematic presence and strength, but does a massive disservice to maintaining a character or character's identity, thus weakening important plot points and story beats. Takahashi masterfully avoided these shortcomings by focusing on and foregrounding character situations and how they might talk directly to other characters in the world, rather than how they might need to directly communicate to the player. This helps to avoid many of the pitfalls that render characters flat and uninteresting. He accomplishes the goal of player engagement by making sure that what he tells us early on about a character's past and temperament are upheld in conversation. Sure, there are the expected expository dumps, mostly in cutscenes, but many of his characters' truly troubled and complicated histories bear on them, and the writing demonstrates this. Take Ziggy and Momo, for instance. Ziggy, whose moniker was actually given to him by Momo to further humanize him, is a character striving to rid himself of any remnants of humanity. After tragedy struck, he took his own life, and was resurrected as a cyborg by Ziggurat Industries. Memories intact to enforce the law, and since he is no longer a human, can't enjoy the same level of rights and can't end his life again, so instead elects to complete missions to save money and rid himself of his organic elements, effectively ending his life. While Momo wishes for precisely the opposite. She is a Realian, a cybernetic organism designed to resemble humans, and are, in fact, quite difficult to tell apart. Momo, as you've no doubt guessed, is ashamed of being a Realian and wants nothing more than to be a human. The relationship and obvious dichotomy here was perfect, not only because of the depth of interaction and backstory, but because of the dialogue and in-character exchanges that made sense given the history of the characters and their personalities. It was one of the stronger relationships in the entire game. Thematically, narratively, it was perfect. And while there are characters with less to dwell on, either due to sparse revelations or easier to digest conflicts with slightly less severe ethical dilemmas, they mostly present themselves as unique and thoughtfully developed, even if it's obvious there's significantly more to them yet to be revealed. Though scant in its revelations, the characters were firmly established and developed in Episode 1, and are my favorite part of the entire game. Another notable strength is its combat, and more precisely, how it challenges the player with each encounter, encouraging the player to understand enemy types, the event slot mechanic, and boosting. One thing Xenosaga does early that I respect and loved, and it was a little daring I guess, is that the game, at a point, demands that the player understands the mechanics of the system in a very specific way. A boss battle. If the rules of the event slot mechanic and boosting are at all not grasped, it's actually pretty tough to advance beyond this fight. While some of the early battles and pacing felt a little like babysitting, this was a nice change and welcome challenge, and kind of rare in the genre. Introducing mechanics that mean something and that have long-term use, sustainability, and ramifications is commendable, and again, something that often gets shoved away as the game progresses and simple attack commands suffice. Saga, instead, seems to try to test you periodically, and even many runs can wipe the party if the player isn't cognizant of a few simple rules. The fighting system feels very much like the natural evolution of what Xenogears initiated, but with the addition of a quirky, and at times opaque, way of customizing characters. Each character starts the battle with 4 ability points, called AP, which are used with ether or attack techniques. The basic attacks are separated into long and short range blows, while ether attacks can be used at any distance. AP that is not used is carried over and can be used to perform over-the-top death blows. The turn order is also displayed, similar to Grandia, and can be altered using the boost technique, either to cut in line for a huge blow, and this often means delaying an enemy's powerful ability, or to cast a clutch heal on a moribund teammate. The event slot is a fun and strategic addition that affects the boost meter, critical damage, and finally a bonus to both tech and ether points after the battle, which are used to upgrade, you guessed it, tech abilities and ether abilities. There are also skill points, which are used to unlock passives from accessories, so basically being able to use the passive without it being tethered to the item. Part of the trick is manipulating it so that you end the battle on the point bonus event slot, or time it so that you nail a critical hit when the event slot augments it without your opponent making use of it. It adds a nice bit of strategic diversity to each turn and even to the entirely mundane grind fest. The one serious critique I have of allocating so many various points and moves is that they are also crucial to combat, and that the level of micromanagement tends to get a little overwhelming, from assigning death blows to ether abilities to determining where to spend TP, as this both increases base statistics and improves death blows, and which abilities to grab using SP. Some of this, and maybe I'll get a little pushback for this opinion, could have been taken away from the player or streamlined in a way to feel a bit more rewarding after hitting certain levels or thresholds. It's not that I detest layered systems or even complicated systems, that's kind of exactly the opposite. It's just that I prefer more clarity and instruction in regards to character progression. This game also brings back the gears, but relabels them as anti-gnosis weapon systems, or AGWS, pronounced eggs. They are also customizable in a variety of ways. Once summoned, eggs have a limited power source and can only be recharged at Egg Station or through the use of specialized equipment. I found little practical use for them, unfortunately, other than as meat shields against harder bosses. They are incredibly expensive to upgrade and upkeep and just aren't necessarily worth the investment, which is a shame because they look grand and imposing and just awesome. It's truly a bummer that these weren't a little bit more relevant. There are also a few side games of note: the drill minigame, the card game, the casino, and finally the eggs battle minigame. Both the casino and the drill game bestow some practical rewards, such as the Brave Soul from the casino, which increases strength as a character's HP decreases, and are at least worth investing a bit of time into. The card game, outside of being a fun standalone game and containing a shocking amount of depth and playability, contains only internal upgrades and accomplishments. In a different era of online accessibility, this diversion could have had its own game. Finally, the battle minigame, and it's just a pure time sink. It's fun for a few rounds and really nothing more. Kind of a missed opportunity, but of course they do have 4 of these minigames and it just started to feel unnecessary. And there's also a database that details the story and explains some terminology, which is obviously really helpful. It almost becomes a necessity to check this at least a few times given the nature of the story. Shion eventually gets a console that allows her to access previous areas of the game too, which enables the party to revisit areas to complete side quests, and there's also an opportunity to invest in different companies through emails. As a decision though, it carries just about no narrative weight, but does bestow some nice rewards for savvy decision making. We're just being lucky. While I was expecting the grand and intricate storytelling in a challenging sci-fi epic, I didn't anticipate, foolishly I might add, the soundtrack to be so impressive. Even if the composer is the highly praised and fabulously talented Yasunori Mitsuda, it shocked me by how precisely it captured every tinge of emotion in the lengthy cutscenes, and during the major story beats, oscillating from sorrow to hope to frightful anticipation. This even after Mitsuda temporarily lost confidence in his own abilities due to a botched track. The game's score is mostly orchestral, with Mitsuda utilizing the London Philharmonic Orchestra for several tracks. He also worked with the Metro Voices Choir and the Celtic singer Joanne Hogg for the theme songs. Joanne also worked on a few Xenogears soundtracks, so her return was pretty cool. Though I am certainly no musicologist and am ill-equipped to dive too deeply into the nitty-gritty of the sounds or give this OST a proper dissection, this was one of the more enjoyable soundtracks I've listened to, often adding some vigor and life to the sterility of spaceship corridors. Takahashi was even quoted as saying, "There are places where this music is going to save the game," and he was very right. Though, I will say the artistic decision to use mostly ambient sound during normal gameplay, while following the cinematic aspirations of Takahashi, hurt the overall impact of Mitsuda's brilliance. It works, I just personally rather be immersed in one of Mitsuda's grand orchestrations than bombarded by machinery and the hum of a ship. It just ends up feeling a little bit disjointed. Coupled with the first-class soundtrack was the wonderful voice acting, with the English dubbing handled by ZRO Limit Productions. They were responsible for Cowboy Bebop and Serial Experiment Lane's dubs and a whole list of other productions. Now, there is the occasional stiff delivery or seemingly uninspired line or two, but personally, I attributed much of this to some of the scripting during these cutscenes, because while mostly fine, dumping chunks of information can start to lose the organic feel of an actual conversation between characters. However, again, this wasn't too big of an issue for me. Each voice is diverse enough and unique and just about perfect for the character that it's a quickly forgiven misstep, even if some found Chaos and Junior's voice actors to be as grating as it gets. I didn't. So what about that title? I've had friends in the past tell me they avoided the entire Xenosaga trilogy because of the supposed chest thumping of Takahashi by referencing Nietzsche's will to power, that it was nothing more than his display of erudition. I found that to be silly then, and after completing the game, it's still very silly. While the title itself is admittedly a bit corny and in your face, the idea that we're always exerting our will, as Nietzsche expressed it, to overcome, to excel, to survive, to simply be, no matter how grand you want to extend this idea, even if most consider it a human behavioral analysis and nothing more, it features prominently in Takahashi's entire body of work. The implementation of this interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power was impressive, and I say interpretation because there was no systematic unfurling of the will to power as a concept by Nietzsche. And though there isn't much literal mention of it, and this was a great decision for storytelling and accessibility to not constantly remind the player of Takahashi's love for a German philosopher, the idea was still clearly hinted at and demonstrated by the events in the game. And while you might be thinking, then why include this in the title at all? I'm going to contend that it's part of his brilliance. If you have no clue what that subtitle meant or who Nietzsche even was or why he's still one of the most influential philosophers some 120 years after he coined the term, it doesn't matter. It doesn't impede comprehension of the core story. Now, it does layer the experience and allows the players with vastly different predilections to pull different meanings out of this cosmic struggle. It was a nod of sorts, and it shows the unending complications of a truly ambitious and domineering genius surrounded by other remarkable professionals. Xenosaga certainly didn't please everybody, but it's a beautiful testament to the strength of great storytelling and concentrated characterizations. I know Takahashi's experiences soured him initially with this medium, thinking he couldn't possibly tell the story he wanted to, and maybe that's true, but it is wildly evident that video games need personalities and intellects like Tetsuya Takahashi and Kaoru Tanaka.